Welcome back, everybody, this week in America. Thank you for joining us on the program today. As mentioned, talking about the book Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape, written by Jessica Luther. Jessica is an independent writer and investigative journalist living in Austin, Texas. Her work on sports and culture has appeared in the Texas Observer, Austin Chronicle, Sports Illustrated, Texas Monthly, Vice Sports, Guardian Sport, and the Bleacher Report. She's had work that's gained national attention. In 2015, of August of that year, when writing for Texas Monthly, she and Dan Solomon broke open the story about a Baylor football player on trial for sexual assault, a case known only by a few in the community and not reported in the media for nearly 2 years. Once again, the book is Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. Jessica Luther with us on the program. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
This really is an important book. In fact, one review called it the most important sports book of the year. And sort of let's set the tone with your background. Like so many of us, you grew up with sports, with college sports. Your parents were big fans and graduates of Florida State University. And you talk in the book about some of those early memories watching football on Saturday afternoon with your dad. And as a student at Florida State, being there in all types of weather, all times of the day or night to watch football. You were really an avid football fan growing up.
Oh, huge. I mean, I tell all sorts of stories about it. My dad got his master's at Southern Miss when Brett Favre was playing, and they played Florida State, and he took me when I was like 8 years old, and he said that I screamed my head off, but luckily no one's going to pick on a little girl. So I've been a diehard Florida State football fan for most of my life. It's something that someone once asked me what's my earliest memory, and I can't even do that. Like, it's just been part of me. It's the only school I applied to go to. I went to every home football game while I was a student there. I went to the national championship game in New Orleans when we played in January 2000 and beat Virginia Tech Hokies to win the championship. It's been a lifelong fandom for me.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned, because you talk in the book about going to the Superdome for the game. It was January 4th, 2000, middle of your sophomore year. And you went through what a lot of us as fans go through when something uncomfortable happens to someone on our team, whether it be college or professional. Peter Warrick, the case where you're actually sort of like, yeah, what he did wasn't all that bad. Talk about the circumstances and what a fan goes through and sort of maybe trying to justify actions on the part of one of their favorite players.
Yeah, during that season, Peter Warrick and was arrested. I think it was felony robbery for stealing goods at a department store in Tallahassee, along with another player, Lavernius Coles, and only Coles really got in trouble for it. Warrick got a slap on the wrist and didn't really face consequences for it. And that was a huge discussion going into the national championship game. I remember lots of Hokie fans sort of poking at our team because Warrick was playing and he had committed a felony in their eyes, right? And I just remember justifying to myself and to whomever I was talking to that it was fine, like that it didn't matter. And that was all I cared about. I didn't have any other way to think about that because I just really wanted him to play on our team. He was very good. And I think he might have ended up being the MVP of the national title game. So he was essential to that team. And as a fan, I was able to easily excuse away behavior just because I didn't really want to engage with what he had possibly done.
Jessica Luther, our guest on This Week in America. The book is called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. A very important book, a very powerful book, a very well-researched book. You took a number of years to work on this. And I want to go back to 2013, and several things were happening that year that really captured your attention. You were talking about a couple of sexual assault cases that played out that year, Navy and Vanderbilt. And I had totally forgotten. In fact, I'm not even sure that I remember reading a whole lot about those because the media at the time really wasn't focusing on those. Talk about those cases and how that played into your career. And then a few months later, you find out about a Florida State football player that's getting national attention.
Right. Yeah. I was in the middle of the summer of 2013 when the four Vanderbilt players were arrested for raping a fellow student. And I don't remember how I saw that story break, but it was mainly covered in the local paper, the Tennessean in Nashville. I was paying attention to it for some reason. These are the kind of things I can't remember now. And then close to the same time, there were 3 Navy players going to trial for raping a fellow midshipman. I believe all 3 of them were found not guilty in the end. But I remember the Washington Post covering it because it's a local story with Annapolis. So yeah, it was these local papers. National sports media really wasn't taking it up. They were much more interested that summer in whether or not Johnny Manziel, the then quarterback for Texas A&M, had been paid for his autograph. And I just, at that point in time, felt this dissonance. I was like, how can there be 7 players at 2 major programs in trouble for the exact same type of crime, horrific crime, and we're not even, like, no one is engaging this topic in any way. And so it was something I was thinking about and had thought a fair amount about when in November 2013, it broke in the media that Jameis Winston, our then quarterback at Florida State, had been under investigation for sexual assault for 11 months. And no one publicly knew about it. The Tallahassee Police Department hadn't done very much with the case and hadn't forwarded it to the state's attorney's office. And so a lot of stuff happened in November 2013 around that case as everyone was waiting for the state's attorney to decide if he was going to press charges, which he ultimately did not do. But because I cared so deeply for the team, I was reading a bunch of stuff at the time about the case, and I, cared about this issue, the issue of sexual violence and how we talk about it. And I wasn't happy with the discussion, with how it gets discussed when we're talking about a player and a team. That's when I started to intervene and wanted to be a part of the discussion around this topic.
Yeah, and you talk in the book, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. Jessica Luther, our guest in the program, author of the book, that you sort of threw away this old fan playbook that you had, that you had followed, that we all follow. It's like, this really doesn't apply to me anymore. And then you've sort of set up a playbook that happens when these situations occur more frequently than we'd like to believe. More frequently you'll find out than is reported as you read the book on Sportsmanlike Conduct. And you sort of compare everything as a playbook. I mean, these schools basically have a strategy involved when something like this happens, don't they?
Yeah, I think a lot of people just have, culturally, we have very specific ways that we respond when we hear about reports of sexual violence, especially against men that are famous or powerful in some way. I feel like we're all working that out right now, and in other avenues, with
exactly.
the presidential election, Nate Parker and Birth of a Nation. We do this a lot. It's just sort of amplified when it's with sports, and so, I don't know if colleges or universities actually have like a set way that they respond, but I just think that they're really easy narratives to tap into. Subtle questioning about whether or not the woman is lying. Some people out and out wonder aloud if she's lying, but then just sort of the minimizing of it all, that just, calling it a mistake or personal issues. There's this way that we so easily minimize the violence. We often erase the person who's actually reported it. They don't even get to be a part of the discussion. And then we really focus on the impact on the athlete and his ability to play a sport. And all of those things are very effective in shifting the focus away from what's happened and moving us away from really talking about this as a systemic problem instead of an individual one. So we really like to, it's like one guy made one bad mistake, makes it a real individual issue. And instead, in my book, I tried very hard to show that this is actually seems to be much more systemic.
Yeah, there are so many issues that you tackle, and one I find interesting, and it was only the last couple of years that I'd even read about that, and that's being able or using women students to basically recruit athletes. And you talk about the Gator Getters at the University of Florida, and it's almost like they're saying to these young men, recruits, if you come here, this is sort of what's in store for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this goes back decades in college football, using women essentially as prizes for coming to school. Sometimes that's an implicit promise, sometimes it's an explicit one. But, it's become against the rules. So you're technically not allowed to use only women in recruitment if the school itself isn't using only women to recruit just general students to the population. It's a very wonky rule that the National Collegiate Athletic Association has created. So it's this weird sort of thing where everyone kind of agrees that it's strange to do this, to use women in this way. But everyone keeps doing, or not everyone, but enough schools keep doing it. And for me, this does two things. One, there are plenty of cases that come out during recruitment where women report sexual violence that's happened to them at recruitment parties, either by recruits or football players. And it's part of this idea that women are accessories to be used up by these programs. And I think that's such a dangerous message to be giving to 17 and 18-year-old guys that are just entering college. And I just see it as part of the spectrum. You know, it can look kind of innocuous. Sometimes it's things like just photoshopping their face on the cover of like a People magazine, arm in arm with Beyonce, right? Like the idea that this is what will happen to your life. On the other end, like hosting a party where women are there to have sex with the players, right? That kind of messaging, I just think, can't possibly be good in this atmosphere with kids that young and coming from the top.
We're talking about the book Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape with Jessica Luther, the author who spent several years in putting the book together. It's interesting as I look at this, and you sort of forget there's a legal obligation, not just a moral obligation, a legal obligation the universities have with Title IX to investigate these complaints. Do they take that seriously?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer at this point in time. It's been about, Title IX's been in effect since 1972, but it's been about 5 years now that the Department of Justice, the Department of Education Civil Rights Office has really taken up this particular issue and making sure that universities are taking seriously reports of sexual harassment and violence on campus. So we're kind of in this weird moment where a lot of universities are scrambling to do better, to follow the rules as they've been laid out over the last 5 years. So it seems to depend on where you are, who you are when you report, what kind of resources the Title IX office actually has available to them to help students. Most Title IX coordinators that I meet and talk to do seem to sincerely care about the job that they're doing and the people to help. It's just, it can be a really big undertaking. I live in Austin, Texas. At the University of Texas is down the road. There's 50,000 students, and there's one Title IX coordinator. So, it's just a really hard question to answer at this point in time. I do think a lot of universities are trying to do better.
Let's talk about what happened to you a little over a year ago. It's the first part of August 2015. You get a phone call with a person you considered a reliable source. Something that was going on at Baylor, and you're looking into it, and you really can't find out a whole lot about it. You're working with a colleague who's writing for Texas Monthly. Talk about that when suddenly, this turned into, as we now know, and we didn't hear about it till all of a sudden the football coach is gone, the president of the university is in deep trouble. Talk about how that unfolded and some of the issues you dealt with, because I think those are pretty typical of what happens in many of the college situations.
Yeah, like you said, it was August 5th, 2015. I got a phone call. I was told that a Baylor football player would be going to trial for sexual assault and that maybe I should look into it. And I tried, and I couldn't find any information about this player, being in trouble legally. And so I called my friend Dan Solomon, and he figured out that the guy was slated to go to trial in a couple weeks. We got in the car that day, drove to Waco, Texas, right up the road from Austin, looked at the court documents. We were just surprised that what we found. He had transferred in from Boise. He had trouble at Boise. He had struggled there as a freshman, even though he did really well on the football team, this player. And then he had a violent incident wherein, he hurt himself, and the coaches at Boise State were warning his girlfriend and his roommate to stay away from him because they were concerned for their safety. He ends up transferring to Baylor within 3 months of being on campus. He's accused of raping another student. He's eventually convicted. We ended up writing about that. But yeah, so we wrote our piece. 2 weeks later, we published. We actually had no idea if anyone would care about the story. It's kind of funny now when you look back on it. We thought it was something, but it became this whole big discussion about like what Baylor knew, what they didn't know, what they did for this guy when he got to campus, if anything, how seriously they took this woman's complaint, because she was actually, the Title IX office at Baylor found that he had not violated the student conduct code and committed sexual assaults, but he then ended up being convicted in a court of law in Waco for sexual violence. So, it's a complicated case, like a lot of them are, but it sort of opened the floodgates. And we've now learned a whole lot more about Baylor. In the wake of our reporting, they hired an outside law firm who came in and did an internal investigation. And it was the findings of that investigation that led to the firing of the head football coach and the demotion of the president. He's now gone. And then the athletic director also resigned.
You mentioned something that's interesting, that it came in from Boise State. And in the book, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape, that's one way some schools handle situations like this. It's like, we'll let you transfer to another school, and the other school has the problem, which was the case in Baylor with the student coming in from Boise State.
Yeah, it's just something that's pretty normal. You get, players who get dismissed from the team, or they quote unquote have personal issues, and then they will transfer to a different program, and then sometimes they will get reported again for the same type of violence. I will also say coaches do this too. Coaches get in trouble and then they sort of bounce to a new program. We might see the head football coach at Baylor at a new program very soon. So this is just one of the ways to sort of shuffle everybody around. And one of my things is that I want to know like what they're doing for these guys when they take them in, if they've had, anger issues or violence issues at previous programs. Like, are they working with them? Are they helping them? On top of sort of worrying for the community that they're bringing them into. It's pretty common. It's so common that the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, and the Big 12, which Baylor is in, have both created transfer policies. If you are dismissed from a team, you cannot, for domestic violence or sexual violence, you cannot transfer into a Big 12 or SEC team anymore. So, these two conferences seem to get that they should be doing something about this.
It's interesting, and you mentioned that we almost see a pattern. Briles loses his job. You see in other situations where coaches lose their job, they go to a smaller school, not in one of the 5 power conferences, do well there, and work their way back up, and suddenly everybody has amnesia like 4 or 5 years, on down the line. The book is pointing out exactly what we're talking about in the program today, but also part of the book is talking about concrete steps that we can use to maybe alleviate some of the problem, hopefully do away with the problem. Talk about a couple of those. Some are very simple, like fire people, bring in more women, and maybe bring in people that aren't fans or alumni members that sort of have a more objective look at what's happening.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I wrote the chapter about firing people at the top, coaches, university administrators, people who sort of control the system but often aren't held accountable. I wrote that chapter like a year and a half ago. And so to see the people at Baylor be held, to that standard was really something, I will say. But I do think that matters. I think, there's a lot of money in college football. People are making a lot of decisions because it lines their pocketbooks. So hitting them where they're, in their pocketbooks, I think would help. I start that entire section by talking about the fact that we just need better consent education. This is really important to me. I think as a culture, we fail at teaching consent across the board. It's sort of strange to say we should start in college. I don't think that. I think we should start in kindergarten. We all have, in any relationship, you learn to set boundaries and have, respect for the other person, and building healthy relationships matters in so many ways. I do think universities need to be doing that work as well, though. At this point, everything is bad enough that teaching consent seems paramount at this point in time. And I always like to highlight what you said, hiring women. We talked earlier about how women only really show up in these spaces as accessories. I think if more women were in the locker room, if more women were making decisions, administrative decisions, if there were more women in sports media in general, I think that would help flush out that women are full human beings. I think, decisions around these things would be better, more nuanced. There'd be better discussions about them. I'm a huge advocate for hire women.
In the book, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape by Jessica Luther, our guest on the program, a couple minutes left in the show. You talk about the problem is not just the perpetrators, and you list everybody who's really complicit in this, including the media. Media now, and you're covering the team, you're relying on the team, you sort of become a fan guy because you want to get the good quotes, you want to be on the good side of the coach. Do you feel the media over the last couple of years, with all these stories breaking, maybe taking a more journalistic approach to how they cover these teams?
Yeah, I actually think the media chapter is kind of writing a book is so strange. It takes such a long time and things are changing in real time. So the media chapter to me, it feels the oldest maybe of everything. I do think media is doing better. I think because we're having such a big discussion about this, with Baylor in particular, that the media is getting that they need to be more careful in how they report this stuff. They do often censor the athlete, and I think that's really dangerous in these kind of cases where we're talking about someone did something to someone else, and both of those people need to be represented in how we write about this and frame this and talk about it. It's a hard job. It's hard to write on this topic. You have to know so much. You have to know about consent, about trauma, about how cops investigate, how Title IX offices investigate, what the DA does, what the district attorney does, how to read a civil lawsuit. These are all these sort of things that beat writers who are normally just covering a team from the sidelines maybe don't know. And so it does seem to me that people are getting more careful and they're reaching out more and trying to figure out the best way to tackle, pun not intended, to tackle this issue when it comes up.
You start by talking, you've got a quote in there that I'm going to paraphrase, Kurt Cobain, and it's like, we're sort of approaching this wrong. We're talking about not allowing yourself to be in a position where you can be the victim of sexual assault, rather than saying, guys, you shouldn't be beating up on women anyway. Right.
Yeah, this is just a, fundamental shift that we need to have in our society when we talk about this issue. I think the biggest or the most common way we talk about this is we tell women how not to get raped instead of men how not to rape,
yes.
Right? And that does matter. For me, one of the ways we talk about this is, for a long time with consent, it was always no means no, which puts a bunch of all the burden on the person who's about to become the victim to say no, to fight hard enough, to make it clear that they don't want what's about to happen. There's been a shift now, and people are trying to get yes means yes to be it. Like, if both people in that moment aren't saying yes, then that's not good enough. And that shifts, again, equal weight on both parties in that moment to participate and to make sure that they are actively getting consent from the other partner. And that, to me, is a good example of how we're changing the way we're talking about this.
Got about a minute left. What kind of reaction are you getting? I see now we're beginning a national conversation because of the book and because of the stories and putting it all together. It's one thing to have just a couple of isolated cases people can vaguely recall because they're sports fans and they happen over the last 5 or 6 years. To have all of those in a book, and I'm sitting reading one after another. Are we starting to make some progress?
I think so. The response to the book has actually been really positive. I assumed it wouldn't be because I feel so primed for people to be mad at me about this topic. But I think you're right. Most of the time I write about an individual university and fans feel picked on and they feel defensive. Whereas with the book, it's so systemic and there's so many different universities and programs and coaches and all sorts of people are implicated really in the book, that it makes it clear that I want to tackle this as a systemic issue. And I think people are really responding to that in ways that give me hope.
You've done an excellent job. I started off by saying it's been called the most important sports book of the year. I think after listening to Jessica talk for the last 20 minutes, you'll agree with that. The book is Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape. Jessica Luther, the author, our guest on the program. The book is, of course, available all across the country. Jessica's website is jessicawluther.com. You go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on to information on the book. Jessica, excellent job. It's a book that needed to be written. You did it so well. Thank you so much for being with us on the program.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're listening to This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. Back in just a minute.